Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. And in this show, we discuss topical global issues, have conversations with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers, and give you the context you need to understand the world today. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more. And now on with the show. As I'm recording this, battles are raging in Tripoli between forces aligned with the UN-backed government and a renegade general named Khalifa Haftar. Haftar and his allied militias had controlled eastern parts of the country, including the city of Benghazi. But in recent weeks, he has marched his troops westward towards the capital Tripoli in an effort to oust Libya's internationally recognized government. Several hundred people have been killed in this fighting, thousands have been displaced, and the situation is now very much on the precipice of descending into a full-blown civil war. On the line with me to discuss what is happening in Libya and why we need to be paying attention to this escalating crisis is Mary Fitzgerald. She is a researcher who has been focusing on Libya since 2011, and in this conversation, she breaks down the complex dynamics of this conflict in ways that I found very understandable. The episode is an excellent explainer on this currently unfolding crisis in Libya. She explains who Khalifa Haftar is and how geopolitics are very much driving events on the ground in Libya right now. We kick off discussing a rather unusual turn of events. On April 19th, I and every other reporter who subscribes to the White House email list received a note in our inboxes that was a White House summary of a phone call between Donald Trump and Khalifa Haftar. And in that summary, the president seemed to throw his support behind the renegade general. Thus, reversed, as far as we can tell, U.S. policy on Libya, which was to support the UN-backed government. Now there's a big question looming over what side the U.S. actually supports in this ongoing conflict. If you are listening to this episode contemporaneously, you'll notice that I don't have an advertiser for this episode. You won't hear an ad because I've been spending most of my time preparing interviews and delivering you great content and less time on the business side of things. And this is sort of an unfortunate hazard of running an independent podcast basically by myself, but it also demonstrates the importance, I think, of listener support. So if you rely on this show to bring you stories from around the world that you otherwise would have missed, I would so appreciate your support. Please become a premium subscriber to the podcast, and when you do, you will unlock a host of rewards, including bonus episodes and access to my Dawn's Digest Global News Clips service. If you are not aware of what that is, this is an aid in development and global news clip service to which big organizations like USAID and the UK House of Commons and many others subscribe. But since I run it, I can make it available to people who support the show with a recurring monthly contribution via Patreon. So if you support the show, if you become a premium subscriber, you can unlock access to this daily morning news clips service. I'll post a link to the Patreon platform in the description field of the podcast. That's where you can make your contribution. Thank you in advance. Thank you for supporting the show. For those of you who are already premium subscribers, thank you for making this specific episode possible. And now here is my conversation with Mary Fitzgerald. Okay, so just to kick off, I would love to get your take on this seemingly bizarre turn of events from here in the United States last Friday when the White House released a statement seemingly in support of Haftar, which seemed to reverse U.S. position, which was to support the UN-backed government. How do you make sense of what that statement from the White House meant?
Well, there has been a lot of speculation over the exact circumstances and context of this statement. The statement referred to a conversation that Trump had with Khalifa Haftar, that is the commander who launched an offensive on Tripoli, seat of the UN-backed, UN-recognized government on April 4th, an offensive that has triggered fighting that up to now has claimed about 250 lives and displaced 30,000 people. So Haftar has shown since April 4th, since launching that offensive, has shown no indication of backing down. In fact, he has told a number of people, including UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, that he's determined to press on with this offensive. So with that in the background, people were quite surprised by this turn of events last week and the news of this call between Trump and Haftar, because according to the White House statement on the call, many people saw this almost as an endorsement of Haftar.
The language was like flowery and glowing of Haftar.
Right, and praising him for his role in fighting terrorism, as the statement put it, and also securing Libya's oil infrastructure. It went on to talk about Trump and Haftar's shared vision, that they discussed their shared vision on a democratic future for Libya. I have to say that element of it did raise eyebrows in Libya, given that Haftar is on record in media interviews as saying Libya is not ready for democracy, something he's repeated to several diplomats over the years as well. So it really put a cat among the pigeons, if you like. And media interviews since with Fayez Sarraj, the head of the so-called Government of National Accord, that UN-backed government in Tripoli, have shown that I think he is feeling a little nervous following this and wondering what exactly is happening in terms of U.S. policy.
Because it was wasn't only like a month ago or less than that Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, was expressing his support for that UN-backed government.
Indeed, and calling for a stop to the fighting, and in those initial statements calling on the various factions to return to their previously held positions. The State Department released a readout of a meeting that Pompeo had with the British Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt after that statement from the White House, that again kind of echoed what Pompeo had said before, and was certainly about about returning to some kind of dialogue. But we know that a few days after the Trump-Haftar call at the UN Security Council, the US declined to support a draft resolution which had been drafted by the UK calling for a ceasefire. So right now there's a lot of questions over what exactly US policy, how it stands now, and how it may play out in the days and weeks to come.
Do you have a sense of what inspired or caused or motivated Trump to release that statement and sort of reverse U.S. positions so sharply and suddenly?
There is little information that would explain the kind of context and background to the call. We do know that Haftar had a conversation with John Bolton at one point in recent weeks as well. So there has been communication. There is some speculation in Libya that this could have come out of, let's just say, unconventional channels, alternative channels. And what's interesting here is that quite a few pro-Haftar Libyans had, during the presidential election campaign, openly expressed hope that Trump would become U.S. president. At the time, many of them were saying, I think he'll be our kind of guy. He will back Haftar. He's going to have similar views to ours in terms of the problem in Libya and ways of solving that problem. Of course, many of those attitudes changed with the travel ban, because Libya was one of the countries affected. But there was still that kind of sense that, if Trump gets on board, he's our guy.
So could we maybe take a step back, and can you explain who is Khalifa Haftar? Where did he come from? And how did he sort of make it this close to sort of overtaking Tripoli?
Well, Haftar is a figure with a decidedly checkered history in the eyes of many Libyans. He was a young military officer when he took part in the 1969 military coup that brought Muammar Gaddafi to power. He later fell out with Gaddafi following his role in Libya's disastrous war in Chad. And after that, he drifted in opposition circles for many years. He lived in the US for over 20 years. And then he pitched up in Libya in the first months of the 2011 uprising against Gaddafi. I was actually in Benghazi when Haftar arrived, and I remember the consternation it caused, because it was as if his reputation very much preceded him in terms of a mercurial, difficult personality who insisted he had to have a senior role, if not the role. So at that time, he was involved in jockeying with Abdel Fattah Yunus, a general who had defected early on in the uprising, over who would actually be the main commander of the rebel forces. Haftar didn't get what he wanted in terms of positions during the 2011 uprising, and he didn't get a position in the post-Gaddafi dispensation either. So he basically spent the years between 2011 and February 2014 traveling around Libya. He was holding meetings. It wasn't really clear what he was up to, and people didn't take him particularly seriously. And that was the same when in February 2014, he basically appeared on TV and announced or called for the suspension of the government of that time and said that the army would save the country. The then Prime Minister, Ali Zaidan, accused Haftar of attempting a coup. An arrest warrant was issued for him, but he basically disappeared and popped up again in May 2014 when he announced what he called Operation Dignity, or Karama in Arabic, which he presented as a war on terrorism, a war aimed at rooting out extremist groups, including the UN-designated Ansar al-Sharia in Benghazi in eastern Libya. But a key part of the civil conflict that Libya fell into in 2014 was this fear of Haftar's ambitions. This idea that many had in the months of early 2014, and certainly after he launched that Operation Benghazi, a fear that he was merely using this campaign against extremism as a pretext. It was a vehicle to build up a base and towards his ultimate ambition, which was to become military ruler of Libya. I met Haftar a few weeks into the launch of that operation in Benghazi. I met him in early June 2014, and he grew particularly testy during our meeting when I told him that I had been struck by the number of Libyans I had met who supported the idea of his operation, who wanted a proper army and police in Libya. But they had a lot of reservations about him, a lot of misgivings, and a lot of questions about what his real motive actually was.
And how did he express his misgivings with you?
Well, because at the time, the narrative Haftar very much wanted to present was that he was selflessly coming out of retirement, because he is 75 actually this year, to take up this cause of fighting terrorism in Benghazi in eastern Libya. So he didn't like being challenged on these questions that Libyans had about his ultimate ambitions. He was saying, however, he said, if the Libyan people ask me to be a president or prime minister at some point in the future, then I would consider that. So it showed that, he was willing to accept that was something that was on his mind. So that fear of Haftar's ambitions, a fear of Haftar, this idea that Haftar was seeking to impose himself as military ruler of Libya, was a key driver in the civil conflict that started in summer 2014 and remains a key driver today. The Haftar conundrum, as I call it, has been a key obstacle to the UN dialogue process that began in late 2014, which attempted to stem that gathering conflict.
So I'd like to talk about that political process that the UN and the UN Special Envoy has tried to broker for a while. But first, I just want to be clear with something. So for the last several years now, Haftar has essentially controlled large swaths of eastern Libya, Benghazi and surrounding provinces.
Well, I think, we have to, first of all, say that control is always a relative term in Libya.
Fair enough.
Haftar has a measure of control in eastern Libya, but you have to understand also the reality of his forces. Haftar leads what self-styled forces that he has named the Libyan National Army, or LNA. Interestingly, in Arabic, the precise translation from Arabic is the Libyan Arab National Army, which is interesting because that explicitly Arab reference has made many within Libya's non-Arab minorities very uneasy about the force, and it has affected their support for it and has actually fueled resistance and opposition to it. So what Haftar calls his LNA it includes a military nucleus. And it's important, actually, we have to take a step back here and talk about the army in Libya as it existed pre-2011 and post-2011. And in fact, one of the biggest challenges Libya has faced post-2011 is security challenges arising from the fact that by the time the uprising started against Gaddafi in February 2011, Gaddafi, who had come to power through a military coup, was so fearful that a coup would be attempted against him that over the 42 years he was in power, he essentially hollowed out the Libyan army, instead building up battalions that were headed by his sons, so they would be loyal. So by the time the uprising against him started, the Libyan army was a shell of itself. And what happened to it post-2011 was that it essentially fell apart. Haftar managed to bring some of those military officers from the old Gaddafi-era army together to form his LNA. But there was also a substantial number of those former military officers who did not join and actually have been strongly opposed to Haftar's LNA since 2014. So the LNA is essentially a military nucleus surrounded by fighting forces that include tribal militias, hardline Salafist fighters, Saudi-inspired Salafist fighters who support Haftar, foreign mercenaries. Several UN reports have detailed Haftar's use of Sudanese rebels, for example, and then one commander who's wanted by the International Criminal Court for alleged war crimes. So that is the LNA. It rests on a fragile, fluid coalition of interests in eastern Libya where Haftar's stronghold is. So again, going back to this point about control is a relative term in Libya, and everything rests on very fluid alliances that can shift according to how certain factions and individuals see their interests at a particular time.
So ahead of this assault that the LNA has launched on Tripoli, the UN had been sort of seeking to kind of broker a political accord between Haftar and the central or the UN-backed government in Tripoli. Can you talk a little bit about what that process looked like? I mean, I know that the UN Secretary General rather recently even went to Libya to try to lend his support to this process.
Well, indeed, and Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, was actually in Tripoli on April 4th, the day Haftar launched his offensive, to try and give a fresh boost to that UN process. So, if people were in any doubt as to Haftar's contempt for that UN process, and he has tried to undermine it at pretty much every turn since it began in late 2014, the fact he chose to launch the offensive the day Guterres was visiting Tripoli, said a lot in terms of its audacity. The offensive actually came at a moment of relative optimism in some quarters in terms of next steps. The UN was due to convene what it presented as a national conference, which would have included hundreds of Libyans, political figures, figures from armed groups, but also civil society, aimed at trying to kind of forge some kind of consensus on the path ahead, political and otherwise, with the idea that Libya could possibly have national elections presidential and parliamentary, at some point within the next year. That national conference, which was supposed to take place the week after Haftar launched his offensive, has now been postponed indefinitely. And the UN process is essentially in tatters. The UN Special Envoy to Libya, Ghassan Salameh, said just last week to the BBC, he said what Haftar has undertaken in Tripoli looks more like a coup than anything else, referring to the fact that not only had Haftar launched this military offensive, but his camp in eastern Libya have also claimed to have issued arrest warrants for the head of the UN-backed government and his colleagues in Tripoli. Yeah. So the UN process, which was already faltering, everybody was pinning their hopes, if you like, on this national conference, which has now been postponed indefinitely. I think now the key question is, what does the wreckage of this situation that is ongoing and the fighting continues, what will the wreckage look like in terms of picking up the pieces of any kind of political process if and when the fighting finishes?
And on the fighting itself, from what I've read, and I'd love your take on this, Haftar seems to have overestimated his chances of success, and that forces in Tripoli would sort of dissipate upon the arrival of his forces, but the fighting seemed to have been much more intense than anticipated, and his sort of strategic gains were less robust than he might have anticipated. Is that sort of a fair summary of sort of the military side of things?
Yes, indeed. So Haftar appears to have miscalculated on two counts. Number one, he overestimated his ability to essentially flip armed groups in Tripoli and in Western Libya more generally to his side. This was a strategy that worked pretty well for him in Eastern Libya in recent years, but also earlier this year, Haftar pushed into Southern Libya, where he managed to form alliances, handing out largesse, etc., managed to flip different armed groups to his side. He clearly thought this would work in Tripoli too. And in fact, not only had he been vowing to march on Tripoli since 2014, but he had been saying over the last year that when he gets to Tripoli, he'll take Tripoli without bloodshed. So he miscalculated in terms of the flipping of armed groups, because actually very few have flipped, and certainly none of the key powerful armed groups in Tripoli. He also underestimated the swiftness and scale of the counter-mobilization against him. The counter-mobilization against him in Western Libya has been one of the biggest mobilizations of armed groups we've seen since 2011. And what I find interesting is that the rhetoric in some quarters in Western Libya is reminiscent in several ways of 2011. While the rhetoric in Haftar's camp in certain quarters is reminiscent of what we heard in the early weeks of his operation in Benghazi in 2014, when many of his supporters were saying this is going to be over in weeks, when in fact it lasted 4 years.
So I wanted to ask you about the geopolitics of this. How significant, important is the backing of Saudi Arabia and UAE of Haftar to his political and military operations?
Well, Haftar's external support has been key from the beginning, since 2014. And, it's clear that Haftar is really in many ways as powerful as his external backers have made him since then. Egypt has backed Haftar.
So to a significant degree then, Egypt, yeah.
Yes. So Egypt has backed him since 2014 because essentially Cairo felt that Haftar was the best bet in terms of securing its border with Libya. The UAE supported Haftar largely because of this kind of narrative that the Emiratis pushed of this idea of a battle against the Muslim Brotherhood and other political Islam currents throughout the region, and Haftar's narrative very much kind of dovetailed with that. And both Egypt and the UAE have, according to several UN panel of experts reports, repeatedly violated the arms embargo on Libya in their support of Haftar, and are clearly continuing to support him now with this offensive, even though there are indications that some in Cairo were a little more uneasy about the way this offensive has unfolded. What is interesting is the Saudi connection here, in that a few weeks before Haftar launched his Tripoli offensive, he visited Riyadh, where he was accorded pretty much the protocol of a visiting head of state. He met with King Salman, he met with MBS. And the very much the kind of optics and also the statements surrounding that visit were that they completely endorsed his vision of what was happening in Libya and how to tackle it. We've also seen reports over the last week. There was one in the Wall Street Journal citing Saudi officials saying that they had offered Haftar tens of millions in support of his operation, and claiming that he had accepted that offer. The other interesting element of this is that within the first 24 hours of Haftar's offensive on Tripoli, many of us noticed that we saw this avalanche of tweets coming from Saudi or Saudi-linked Twitter accounts referring to Libya, referring to Haftar, referring to the offensive. And that was unprecedented. We've never seen such a Saudi pile-on in terms of what's happening in Libya. So that all of that combined suggests that Riyadh is heavily invested in what has been happening since April 4th.
So I guess how concerned are you that this fighting around Tripoli will accelerate into a regional proxy war that ends up in like a total bloodbath like Yemen?
Well, that is a real concern right now, because given the failure of the UN Security Council to basically agree on a resolution merely calling for a ceasefire, and it wasn't just the US that declined to support that resolution. It was also Russia, which is the other interesting player in this. Russia has engaged with Haftar at different points in recent years, while insisting that it is engaging with a range of players across the Libyan political spectrum. And of course, like all the other external actors, insisting that it supports the UN-backed government. But there are a lot of questions right now in terms of how Moscow may see the current situation and whether it may weigh in more heavily in favor of Haftar, depending on how the situation plays out on the ground. But what we're facing right now in Tripoli is, given that Haftar hasn't achieved the momentum he was clearly hoping to achieve very early on. He's suffered a number of setbacks. Given the size of that counter-mobilization against him, there is a very real fear of a protracted conflict in the Libyan capital, a city that is home to between 1.5 and 2 million people, a city that is also home to the two pillars of the admittedly shaky Libyan state, that is the National Oil Corporation and the Central Bank of Libya, two key elements of the Libyan state, which, thanks to Gaddafi, is a classic rentier state and totally oil dependent. So it's in no one's interest for a protracted battle for control of Tripoli that could last, if not months, possibly years. There's also a concern that what we would see in Tripoli and Western Libya is further fragmentation amongst armed groups. So basically armed groups dividing amongst themselves in terms of which particular camp or faction they may support. And that makes, of course, the prospects of bringing the fighting to an end even more remote.
So I guess finally, to conclude, what indicators will you be looking at in the coming, days, weeks, and months that might suggest to you how the situation will evolve, what direction this conflict might take?
Well, I think it's extremely concerning right now that we don't have an agreement for call for ceasefire at the Security Council. Similarly, there is little agreement in Europe amongst the EU member states in terms of forging some kind of a more robust collective response. It's been very timid so far from Europe, despite the fact that this is essentially a gathering storm on Europe's southern neighborhood, and one that can affect a range of challenges Europe already faces from Libya, including migration flows, security, etc. But because France has supported Haftar and in the past, including militarily in eastern Libya, France has been trying to water down more robust response collectively at EU level. So given that situation, and given that there seems to be little possibility of a stronger response internationally to basically just, first of all, bring a halt to the fighting, it looks pretty grim in terms of the scenario. It seems as if the UN envoy Ghassan Salame has stepped back. He has said over the last week that the prospects of any kind of negotiation right now are pretty much zero. Fayez Sarraj, the head of the GNA in Tripoli, has been giving interviews where it very much seems like he and his colleagues feel abandoned by the internationals who once swore support to them. So Haftar, of course, will be watching all of this and seeing those dynamics, seeing those shifts, and seeing obviously opportunity in this. And I think that the conversation he had with Trump last week, the way that was presented by the White House afterwards, definitely Haftar and his camp have seized on that as somehow an endorsement of what they're doing. What Haftar and his people are not hearing right now is very much censure or opprobrium in terms of what he's been doing.
Well, Mary, thank you so much for your time and for your analysis. This was very helpful, timely, and yeah, I'm sort of I'm not optimistic about the situation. Unfortunately, it really seems like the forces are aligning to accelerate this crisis even further.
This is how it appears right now, and the thing is that Libya is not an island. It has the possibility of seriously affecting and infecting the dynamic in a range of neighboring countries: Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, Chad to its southern border, Niger. So what happens in Libya tends not to stay in Libya, and I think that this is something that various internationals really should be keeping in mind in the days and weeks to come.
All right. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Mark. Always a pleasure.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Mary. That was a very helpful explanation of these currently unfolding events in Libya, which, may be coming to a front page near you soon. This is one of those events, one of those crises that could escalate, I think, very quickly. As always, please do become a premium subscriber to the show. I so appreciate your support. You literally help me keep the lights on, and by keeping the lights on, I mean pay my host server fees. Thank you. Thank you very much for keeping this podcast operational and helping me do what I do. And if you are considering being a premium subscriber, just go do it. Click that button in the description field of the podcast. You'll get an email from me right away. Thank you, and we'll see you soon. Bye.